Hello, what is up, everyone in the library world? This is Tisha coming from the Broadview Public Library District, and I am here with this month's Rainbow Reads. So we have read a very popular book that's out now called The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid for our Rainbow Reads in January. So this book has been very popular recently. I personally have attended 3 book discussions about this book and listened to what various people have to say about the book. And I found it a really interesting book. So the book is about Evelyn Hugo, who is a famous movie actress in like the 1950s. And she is writing, or she has asked a writer named Monique to come and write her life story, to tell about everything in her life. She's famous for having these 7 husbands, and she is now willing to talk about her life and how it came about that she was married 7 times. And this is her story. And I think the title is a little misleading, The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, because, oh, by the way, this is going to be full of spoilers because we're just going to talk about the book a little bit and get into why it is a rainbow read. So the book starts off with Monique Grant. She is a writer at a magazine called Vivant, and her boss, Francine, calls her in the office to tell her that the Evelyn Hugo. So when you think of Evelyn Hugo, maybe think of, let's see, this is terrible because I don't really know any 50s actor, but maybe think of like Elizabeth Taylor, like somebody, or Marilyn Monroe, maybe rolled into one, a little bit Elizabeth Taylor, a little bit Marilyn Monroe, this really well-known kind of sex symbol. I wouldn't say sex symbol, but she was known for being beautiful, for men wanting her. So think of like a Marilyn Monroe type mixed with Elizabeth Taylor, because she was so well known. Everybody knew Evelyn Hugo when she was at her prime in Hollywood. So Francine, Monique's boss, calls her into the office to tell her that the Evelyn Hugo wants her to interview her. And Monique is like, Evelyn Hugo? Like, Evelyn Hugo by this time, Evelyn Hugo is retired. She's been out of the limelight for some years. She's elderly. I think they said she's like in her 70s at this point, and she hasn't done an interview in like decades. So this is a big deal because Evelyn Hugo was a big deal. So this is a big deal. And Monique is wondering why her. So is Francine's. Like, why Monique? Like, Monique isn't this big time writer. Her name isn't well known. She's been working for this magazine, Vivant, for a couple of years now, but she's just a writer, I guess. But she did write this piece for a previous magazine on like death and like the mercy of death or something like that. I can't remember. But it was a popular piece. It was a well-known piece, and it was a well-written piece, I should say. And so that kind of got her name out there a little bit, or the compassion of dying or something like that. So that kind of got her name out there a little bit. So yeah, so Francine tells her that Evelyn Hugo wants to do an interview, but it has to only be Monique. And she tried to convince Evelyn to get these other writers to do it, but Evelyn insisted it had to be Monique Grant, or she would not do it for Vivant, the magazine. So as of now, it is Evelyn Hugo's going to do a cover, like she's going to do a photo shoot, and she's going to do an interview for Vivant. That's the plan. That's what Monique understands. So Monique is, okay, I'm going to go interview the Evelyn Hugo. So Monique goes to Evelyn's house. She meets Evelyn. She meets her maid, Grace. They go out to lunch, and Evelyn tells Monique that, no, I don't want to do this interview for Vivant. I want you to write my biography. I want you to tell my story. So Evelyn kind of lured Monique there under the pretense of doing or I guess contacted Vivant to get to Monique under the pretense of doing a story for Vivant. But really, Evelyn wants Monique to write her story. She doesn't want really anything to do with Vivant. She wants Monique to write her biography. She wants to tell Monique her life story. And they work out terms. Monique agrees, and she comes back and she starts to interview Evelyn. So Evelyn and Monique sit down, and Evelyn opens up with her story. She talks about her first husband and growing up in Hell's Kitchen. Her mom passed away. She lived with her single dad. I don't know if she had any brothers or sisters, but I think she just lived with her dad. And she has a friend. She meets this guy who knows this guy, Ernie. His name's Ernie Diaz. And she talks about wanting to go to Hollywood, discovering people saying that she was beautiful at this young age. She talks about going to the store and using this boy for some, like using her body, like unbeknownst to her, like this is what he wanted, and figuring out that, kind of figuring out at a young age that she has this appeal to men and that she wants to get out of Hell's Kitchen, and her looks might just be what does it. So she introduces herself to Ernie Diaz, kind of tells Ernie that she's older than what she really is. She hitches a ride to Hollywood. She gets married to Ernie. And she starts to become famous. Like she starts to get noticed. She starts to be in movies. And later on, she divorces Ernie per the studio's request because she's starting to get big. Ernie, I think, was like a technician or something. And the studio, I think Evelyn signed this contract, and the studio kind of now owns her. So the studio is molding her to become this famous actress. So she starts off as Evelyn Herrera. And then later on, because of Hollywood, she becomes Evelyn Hugo. Her name changes. I think her background is she's Cuban. But the studio changes her name. They convince her to change her name to Evelyn Hugo. She picks out Hugo. They dye her hair a blonde. And thus begins the life and career of Evelyn Hugo. So she divorces Ernie. She starts to date these famous actors. She marries Don Adler, who is a really famous actor. He comes from a famous family. Don starts abusing her in the marriage, but she really loves Don. Like she was actually in love with Don, and she loved him. And he starts abusing her, and she stays in the marriage. Don keeps abusing her, and finally they get a divorce. But I don't know if Evelyn ever told anyone that Don was abusing her. I think that during that time they were saying that the studio and the people around them discouraged it because of who Don Adler was. And he was such a big deal, apparently, but that doesn't excuse the fact that he beat his wife. And so I don't know if Evelyn ever told anyone during the time that Don was abusing her. I think people knew, but they didn't really do anything about it, or they didn't really acknowledge it. They kind of just told her to keep it hush hush, because I'm not sure why, because of her career, maybe because of who Don was, because of, I don't know. I won't know. And I don't know the whole politics of domestic abuse. So I just knew that some people knew without it being said, but no one really did anything about it during that time. So Evelyn kind of has enough of Don abusing her, and she divorces Don Adler, and she marries another husband. but during the time that she catches Don cheating. I think that was the thing. I think she catches Don cheating on her at a party, at a rap party. And I think that was the catalyst too that prompted the divorce. So anyway, but before that, Evelyn does this movie, Little Women. She does a remake of Little Women. And she meets this actress, Celia St. James. Celia St. James is playing Beth in this movie. And she and Evelyn become friends. And there are all these rumors going around about Celia. Celia's a better actress, and they are consigned not to like Celia because she will outact them in this movie. And I think Celia gets nominated for an Oscar or wins something for this movie. Anyway, one of the other actresses tells Evelyn that Celia is a lesbian. And Evelyn confronts Celia about it and asks her, "Do you sleep with women?" And Celia kind of deflects the question and asks, "Oh, does this mean you're not going to be friends with me?" Blah, blah, blah. Evelyn kisses Celia, and that starts their tumultuous romance throughout this novel. So one of the questions that Monique asked Evelyn in the beginning, before she even started talking about these 7 husbands, is, "Who was the love of your life?" Monique asked her which husband was the love of your life, or not even which husband, or who was the love of your life. So Monique is thinking that these husbands are the love of her life. Monique has to ask her this twice on 2 different days. She says, "Evelyn, who's the love of your life?" And finally, Evelyn says, "Celia St. James was the love of her life." So she proceeds to tell Monique, how these 7 husbands were, some of them were distractions from the fact that she was actually with Celia this whole time. One of the husbands she's married was Harry, who was a gay man in Hollywood. He was a gay producer. They had a daughter together named Connor. Harry was seeing another man who Celia married. He was a football player. Celia married him, and basically the 4 of them were married to men. Well, basically the 2 of them were married to these gay men, and they were a couple. So Celia and Evelyn were a couple, and Harry and the football player were a couple. But to the outside world, Celia was married to this football player, and Evelyn was married to Harry. So some of her husbands were distractions for media purposes, to deflect, like when rumors started coming out about her and Celia hanging around each other too much or being more than friends. Evelyn would devise a plan to get married, to show that, her and Celia were just friends and fellow actresses or colleagues and stuff. So she got pregnant one time before and she had an abortion. Celia got upset and left her over it. So basically this book was about the romance and the relationship between Celia and Evelyn and the guise of these 7 husbands, marrying 7 men, all to, not initially, but later on, with the exception of Ernie, her first husband, and Don Adler, her second husband, to kind of deflect the relationship of her and Celia from the public. So this was an interesting book. I didn't dislike Evelyn's character and I didn't dislike Celia's character, but I didn't like them either. I think that Evelyn was an honest narrator. Like, I think she was narrating her story, obviously from her point of view. And I think she was honest about that. I think she didn't paint herself in the best light. She even tells Monique, "I'm not a good person." But I think she was being honest about everything that she did and why she did it. I don't think she was trying to make herself seem like a better person than she was. I think she was just trying to tell her truth as she knew it, trying to explain and trying to give homage to Celia, because I don't think no one knew that she was in love with Celia St. James for all the years that she was alive. Like no one, the public didn't know. Um, every time there was a rumor, Evelyn would deflect and get married. That was her diversion, is to marry another man, but still be in love with Celia this whole time. So the book talks a lot about, I interpreted a lot of themes about identity, about Evelyn's identity, her ethnic background, being Cuban, and turning, or I guess having to kind of put that part of her, bury that part of her, maybe to fit into Hollywood, as a white blonde woman. It talks about one of her maids speaking Spanish, and the maid didn't know that she could speak Spanish. And then later on, they moved to Spain, and she kind of picked up her Spanish again. But for years, Evelyn didn't speak Spanish because she wasn't Evelyn Herrera anymore. She was Evelyn Hugo. And it talked about that part of her identity. It talked about her bisexuality. She calls herself bisexual. It talked about that as being part of her identity. And which was interesting because she didn't consider herself a lesbian because she only loved Celia. So she didn't consider herself a lesbian. She considered herself bisexual because she still liked men. She loved Don Adler. She liked Max, one of the husbands she married, who was a director. And it seems like the only woman that she loved was Celia. So it wasn't like she was out there womanizing, or she just wanted to be with Celia. That was whether Celia was a man or Celia just happened to be a woman and happened to be who she loved. So that's how Evelyn felt, that she wasn't a lesbian. She was bisexual because she loved Celia, and Celia happened to be a woman, which was interesting, an interesting take on it. So overall, I thought this book is definitely worth a read. This is my first time reading anything by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Never heard of Taylor Jenkins Reid before this book, before I read this book. And it got all the buzz. Wasn't sure what to expect going into this book. I did not expect the romance between Celia and Evelyn, so I did not expect that that's what this book was about. One part of what this book was about. But I liked the book. I thought it offered, it kind of felt like real life to me, like this could have been a real story, like based on someone real. And maybe she based it on someone real, like maybe she took tidbits and pieces of like Hollywood life from that era, and she created this story. But I thought the story was well crafted. I enjoyed reading about Evelyn's life, even if I didn't necessarily like Evelyn as a character, or Celia as a character. I enjoyed the people around her. Like Harry was one of my favorite characters. Her daughter even grew on me growing up. And Evelyn's last husband, I forget his name, but he was Celia's brother. So I think the novel is definitely worth the read. It was a good novel. The novel felt like I was reading like an old Hollywood, or watching an old Hollywood movie, like a biography of someone's life, which I think it was intended to be. Obviously it was Evelyn's biography, but, and then it had bits of Monique interspersed in there, in her life and dealing with her husband and her mom and her dad. So I won't give away too many spoilers to tell you, but there is a twist. There is a reason why Evelyn chose Monique to write her biography. And it was kind of expected, but it was a little unexpected. And you have to draw your own conclusions about Evelyn's character based on why she chose Monique to write her biography. And Yeah, so it's definitely worth the read. I think it's worth the read if this is your type of story. Taylor Jenkins Reid is worth the read. Like she has this other book called I think it's called Daisy Jones and the Six that I've been listening to on audio. I actually listened to this book on audio as well. And I like the fact that it had different characters, different people reading the characters. So yeah, if you do want to read this book, read the book definitely. But if you do get a chance to listen to it on audio, I think it's worth to listen to on audio as well. And so is her other book, Daisy Jones and the Six. Um, they are available on media on demand at the Broadview Public Library District. They are also available for checkout at the Broadview Public Library District with your Broadview card, media on demand with your Broadview Public Library card. It's just a few fan fiction pictures of Evelyn and Celia. So yeah, next month's Rainbow Reads, February 23rd, will be One Last Stop by Casey McQuestion. We'll be briefly going over that book and talking about it. Yeah, so thank you for joining us for Rainbow Reads with the 7 husbands of Evelyn Hugo at the Broadview Public Library District. And we will see you next month for one last stop for Rainbow Reads. All right.